I'm Adriana Proser, curator of the Asia Society exhibition, The Art of Impermanence, Japanese works from the John C. Weber collection and the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection. Welcome. I am delighted to be here tonight to actually welcome you to Asia Society's World of Digital Arts programming with a third and final of our public lecture series which accompanies The Art of Impermanence. The exhibition presented spectacular works ranging from the Neolithic period to the 20th century and was a testament to the strengths of two important collections of objects built by New Yorkers passionate about Japan and Japanese art. It explored Japan's unique references to transience through cultural relics, religion, literature, and popular culture that remain as relevant to Japan's culture today as in the past. The exhibition has closed, but you can visit the Impermanence show page on our website and join me for a virtual tour of the exhibition. Please make asiasociety.org/museum your home from home, since our online museum material is accessible 24/7. The fabulous exhibition catalog can be ordered from our online store. It features a spectacular essay by scholar Melinda Takeuchi. Once restrictions are lifted, your order will be processed and you will be notified when shipped. We apologize in advance for shipping delays and thank you for your understanding, patience, and support during this difficult time. The catalog was recently discussed in a program, Preserving Legacy and Scholarship in Print Publications, on the process of art book publication. This is part of our ongoing online museum salon programs in which Asia Society staff and invited guests take a deeper look at museum practices. Just Google Asia Society Museum Salon 2. Support for the Art of Impermanence comes from the Japan Foundation and an anonymous donor. Support for Asia Society Museum is provided by Asia Society Global Council on Asian Arts and Culture, Asia Society Friends of Asian Arts, Arthur Ross Foundation, Cheryl and Charles B. Kay Endowment for Contemporary Art Exhibitions, Hazen Polsky Foundation, Mary Griggs Burke Fund, Mary Livingston Griggs and Mary Griggs Burke Foundation, New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, and New York State Council on the Arts. We are, of course, also deeply grateful to Dr. John Weber for having lent significant works from his collection to present together with objects from the Mr. and Mrs. John D. Rockefeller III collection. I especially want to thank our members for their important support. And if you're not already a member, please do join us. Looking ahead, before we get started, the importance and vitality of this concept of impermanence has not lost its relevance over time, and in fact seems to have become even more pronounced in our current time of uncertainty. Asia Society Museum is still planning to go ahead with its inaugural Asia Society Triennial entitled We Do Not Dream Alone later this year. Visit asiasociety.org/triennial and sign up for the newsletter and updates. Our colleagues in the world of policy and business have an ongoing array of online programs that address foreign relations, business, and politics. For information about all our work here in New York and around the globe, check out www.asiasociety.org. So, tonight's format will be an approximately 50-minute lecture followed by an opportunity for Q&A with a speaker through our online platforms. After this broadcast, the lecture will be posted within a few days on Asia Society's website. Tonight's lecture is entitled Tattered Fans and Talismans, the Symbolism of Battle Fans and the Ethos of Impermanence. And our speaker tonight, we are honored and delighted to have her, is Melissa McCormick, Professor of Japanese Art and Culture at Harvard University. She specializes in the art and literature of pre-modern Japan and earned a BA in art history and Japanese language and literature from the University of Michigan, and a PhD in Japanese art history from Princeton University. After teaching at Columbia University as the Atsumi Assistant Professor of Japanese Art, she moved to Harvard in 2005, where she was promoted to full professor in 2009. Her publications include Tosa Mitsunobu and the Small Scroll in Medieval Japan, University of Washington, 2009, The Tale of Genji, A Visual Companion, Princeton University Press, 2018, and The Tale of Genji, a Japanese classic, Illuminated, 2019, which accompanied an exhibition that she co-curated at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Before we start with Melissa, my thanks to everyone who's watching today. As you've probably noticed, Asia Society is proud to be offering you our quality content free of charge right now. If you enjoy today's program, we ask that you consider giving a gift of any size to support our work. If you're watching on YouTube, you can donate by checking out the link in the video description. And now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Melissa McCormick.
Good evening. Thank you, Adriana, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you all for joining me tonight for an hour or so as we step back in time and visit medieval and early modern Japan. And so tonight I'd really like to thank Adriana and Dr. John Weber and Dr. Julia Meach and the Asia Society for inviting me to speak as part of this lecture series for the Art of Impermanence exhibition. So when I received the invitation, I was given an opportunity to speak on any object from the show. Here's a gallery view for you of the exhibition. And if you saw the exhibition while it was still open in the early spring, or if you viewed the online tour that Adriana is providing, or if you've read the beautiful catalog with, again, a masterful essay by Melinda Takeuchi, then you know I faced an embarrassment of riches. But I was immediately drawn to the black jimbauri, or campaign jacket, and especially its striking white fan, starkly juxtaposed against the dark background on its back. The catalog designer and I seemed to be on the same page, and I was delighted to see it on the cover and know that I'd be speaking about the poster child of the exhibition tonight. Jimbauri surcoats were most commonly sleeveless jackets worn by members of the warrior class over their armor. The image of a ravaged fan emblazoned on the back of a garment made for warriors seems at first paradoxical. In a military context, in which the point of pageantry lies in the show of strength and force, the prominent display of an emblem of fragility might strike one as oddly self-defeating, as on the edge of admitting vulnerability, perhaps closer to a white flag of surrender than a symbol of dominance. Placing the image in its own cultural context, bringing in the philosophical armature of Buddhist impermanence, as done through the insightful selection of this object for the show, helps to eliminate that tension and calls to mind the ethos, among other things, of Bun and Bu. In other words, the belief in the importance of mastering both martial skills required for the battlefield and the intellectual talents needed for strategic thinking and capable government. The latter skill was said to have extended to developing sensitivities to the human condition and an awareness of the fleeting nature of our existence. And it became part of the discourse on the traits of the ideal warrior from the early medieval period onward. But is this framework enough for explaining the meaning of this tattered fan? Might this image convey other connotations, especially when it was made in the 19th century, during the twilight of the rule of the Tokugawa shoguns? So tonight I'd like to explore this garment's imagery and attempt to understand what it might have meant for the person who made it and wore it in the late Edo period. My talk tonight is going to be divided into three separate parts. I'm going to start with the coat itself, introducing you to the details of its manufacture, and then I'll turn to a discussion of the history of the campaign jacket and where this surcoat fits in. In the latter part of the talk, I'll explore the imagery of the folding fan and its use in warrior culture, and then conclude by returning to this jacket and the questions it forces us to pose about the ethos of impermanence. The Weber Jimbauri is immediately identifiable as a Jimbauri. You can tell right away from its distinctive silhouette as a sleeveless vest constructed with two main types of fabric. On the outside is black wool imported from Europe into Japan called rasha. Here you can see characters for that term. It was treated and shrunk so that it has a feel of felt and is relatively lightweight. In contrast to the solemn, serious, pitch black exterior, which is matte and uniform in its texture, the inner lining is pure exuberance. The orange silk fabric bears a Paulonia arabesque pattern called kirikaragusa. This pattern consists of the distinctive 3 large Paulonia leaves and vertical stalks of delicate flowers, commonly stylized in the family crest that you see here. Additional leaves and flowers and coiling tendrils are interspersed within the triple-leaved clusters to create a dense feel that masks the repetitiveness of the pattern. A close look at the lining reveals the source of its luster. Supplementary wefts, horizontal threads interlaced into the warp of the fabric, covered in gold. We can see how the gold has worn away here and there, and imagine the visual impact of the gilt textile when it was first made. And it might be difficult to see here, but one of the first things that really struck me when I saw this coat in person and up close was how it bore the marks of someone who had worn it. So right where you would expect the body to hit the garment, near the back here, and also the sort of frayed edges under the arm and at the neck. So it had the imprint of its human owner in a very kind of striking way that I'll get back to. Lapels that run the length of the jacket reveal the inner lining and are secured open by silk blue cords and 4 silver buttons. A black wool strap across the chest is carefully lined in the same orange silk as the larger coat and fastens together with a lacquered wooden button. The coat has a distinctive collar with rounded edges and epaulettes made of white wool, decorated with blue and gold stitching in a zigzag pattern. You can also see in this close-up a diamond-patterned silver brocade that is stitched around the edges, the borders of this epaulette, the same material used for the piping of the entire jacket that delineates the borders of its dark silhouette. A seam here runs down the back, the center of the lining, joining 2 pieces of fabric together and stopping at the back slit, which is sometimes called a horse riding vent, or umanori. In contrast to the front, the back of the garment is 1 piece of black wool. There's no seam down the upper back, creating a dramatic, contrastive background for the white fan, which takes center stage. It's made of the same white wool as seen in the epaulettes on the front of the garment, which has been sewn to the surface of the coat, an applique. Gold threads are used to create the ribs of the fan. The textile expert Nagasaki Iwao has dated this jacket to the early 19th century for several reasons, including the type and quality of the wool imported from Europe, where it was likely dyed before reaching Japan. The placement of the epaulettes is also closer to 19th century conventions. In earlier coats, like this 18th century example, also in the Weber collection, we see how the epaulettes are thin and narrow and are sewn directly on top of the shoulders. In the later jacket, those epaulettes are clearly visible on the front for maximum decorative effect. It also wasn't until later in the Edo period that these epaulettes began to incorporate a stiff core. And it was around this time, Nagasaki believes, that the Japanese term tachi uke, literally receiving spot for a sword, or perhaps sword guard, came to be used for these shoulder guards. The Weber jacket, in fact, does have a wood or bamboo slat in its epaulettes inserted between the wool pieces. And thank you again, Dr. Weber and Dr. Meach, for allowing me to get close enough to this garment to analyze its anatomy. Another feature of the garment that places it in the 19th century are the lapels, which are not meant to be unfastened to cover the chest to create warmth, but they remain open. This aligns with an overall trend toward the decorative rather than the functional in later Edo military coats, when there were no actual large-scale wars being waged during the so-called Pax Tokugawa. Jinbaori in the 19th century were, in other words, worn in a very different context than military surcoats of earlier periods, and their appearance changed accordingly. Jinbaori from the end of the Muromachi era to the early Edo period were thought to have been worn by military commanders, not the rank and file, while in encampments, outdoors, and while traveling on horseback. They were thought to provide protection from rain, wind, and cold, and to be colorful and bold enough to maintain high visibility. And here I'd like to begin to talk about the history of the jacket known as Jinbaori. And here you can see one of the boldest and most dramatic Jinbaori from the 16th century. So the visibility was important for the troops in one's command. And in 16th and early 17th century, these are among the most famous textiles of pre-modern Japan, with stunning visual designs like this one that even today can stop you in your tracks. In terms of the evolution of the Jinbaori as a type, Nagasaki and others have proposed that the common vest form developed from beltless kosode with sleeves, a relatively narrow silhouette, and straight cut back. Adjustments were made, the sleeves were widened, then removed for maximum freedom of movement. The garments were widened to accommodate armor, and back slits were added for riding on horseback. The influence of European tailoring and dress during this period of Dutch and Portuguese trading activity also shouldn't be underestimated. As the textile expert Terry Milhaupt explained, traditional Japanese clothing construction favors straight edge cutting in order to minimize waste, while garments like these reflect new European influences with their rounded standing collars and curved edges along the arm openings and back slit and lower edges. In fact, Jinbaori bear the traces of the history of early global capitalism better than many other artifacts of the period. From the various types of wool they employed, wool not domestically made in Japan until the late 19th century, including the bright red dyed wool of this garment imported by the Portuguese. Images of Portuguese traders and Jesuits and so-called Namban Byobu, or Southern barbarian screens, show not only the types of clothes that made an impact on Japanese dress, but the kinds of goods and materials that began to be incorporated into Jinbaori. Take a look at these objects, for example. Next to the tiger pelts in this window, you find clusters of peacock feathers here. This Jinbaori is not actually made from peacock feathers, but it gives that illusion of such a feathered garment. It does so through the skillful use of colorful thread in a weave pattern that fools the eye. The feathers of indigenous birds were, though, actually used and put to use in these spectacular examples, made of blue jay feathers on the left and bird feathers arranged in the pattern of a striking large gourd on the right. A Jinbaori made out of high-grade Indian cotton sarasa, later called chintz, is a clear reminder of the state of the world and activities in South Asia in the early modern period. Produced by talented weavers in Bengal, this textile, the sarasa, the chintz, was so popular throughout the world that it fueled the activities and the fortunes of the British East India Company. Fabrics from Persia and from Persian carpets even made an appearance in Jinbaori. Where else but in a coat worn by, you got it, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Hideyoshi's appropriation and manipulation of textiles from far-flung regions clearly align with his visions of military domination, even beyond the Japanese archipelago. In this way, early jimbauri, worn by military commanders with power and the money to commission the kinds of jackets exactly the way they wanted them during the transition from the age of warring states to the establishment of the Tokugawa Bakufu, show a remarkable degree of personalization and an individualized visual language to express a given man's identity and ideology. These garments also have an incredibly sophisticated design sense. Their designs communicate a kind of unique martial ferocity that is at once flamboyant, but also very deliberately wraps its wear in symbols intended to augur success. Look at the stunning Mount Fuji jacket with its asymmetrical design of an erupting Fuji with a numinous plume of golden smoke that evokes the power of the sacred mountain. Or take a look at this light purple wool coat said to have been owned by the daimyo Date Masamune, a character who we'll return to in a moment. But here you can see the Date crest with its birds and bamboo on between the shoulders, as well as this multitude of 5 colored, what are usually called polka dots. Which brings me back now to our 19th century jimbauri and its tattered fan. By this time, these surcoats were no longer just for commanders, but they also included wearers who were among the rank and file. And a number of other uses came into being as well. This is an incredibly interesting example of an Ainu jimbauri made in Hokkaido in the 19th century, which utilizes this elm bark textile and a material called ezo nishiki. This was apparently worn by a man for an Ainu omusha ceremony. And luckily enough, we have this incredible painting from the 19th century documenting such a ceremony here, where you can see Ainu officials bowing before Japanese magistrates at an exchange market. And looking a little bit more closely, you see how each and every man is donning a jimbauri with relatively unique patterns on the back. Other uses in the 19th century involve theatrical performance. And here's another incredibly special one that was used for a kyogen performance by a Hosokawa daimyo, but actually for his wife, performed in the women's quarters in the 19th century. And you can see how this would have been perfectly suitable for a theatrical performance with its spectacular dragons on the front and back. And of course, the kyogen play was about the tales of the Heike, which we'll be hearing more about in a moment. Now, the 250 years of peace that are known as the Pax Tokugawa, of course, meant that there were no large-scale wars, but we do have images that show mobilized troops and regiments, and here you can see how they are following a commander on horseback, and the figures are a bit difficult to make out, but you can see how each and every one of them is wearing a jimbauri, and here is another example where not only is the commander wearing a jimbauri, but we see now in 1865 at least the introduction of soldiers wearing Western-style uniforms, carrying muskets, and here someone even using a drum, a Western-style drum. And here's actually a better image to show you if we can trust the coloration of this hand scroll, that Choshu expedition that has each and every individual in a jimbauri, but also of very different fabrics and colors, as though each man was able to commission his own instead of being highly regimented. So this makes me think that there are elements to the 19th century jimbauri in the Weber collection that might be related to the influx of Western military uniforms, or at least some exposure to Western military uniforms. The silver buttons, for example, and these these silk cords, although these are ties that are very much in the Japanese tradition. I couldn't help but be reminded of a jacket like this, a Western style military jacket of the period. And you can see the use of metallic buttons, the epaulettes, the standing collar, and a slimmer profile of a garment, which is what we see in trends for the 19th century jimbauri. And here's just a gratuitous portrait from 1811 that I thought was quite interesting, just to think about what was going on in the world at the same time that our jimbauri was made. Yet perhaps another influence, we saw that drum being played in the image of the Western uniforms alongside the Japanese jimbauri. A drum from the United States in 1864, a military drum with its zigzagging pattern on the outside. I couldn't help but have that in mind, looking at this zigzag pattern, this very military-esque pattern that we're used to seeing in the West on the Weber jimbauri. It's one that is actually common enough to 19th century garments. And here I'm showing you an array of those vests, the jimbauri, in all of the different fabrics. And this is actually where individualization would occur. Unlike those 16th century examples, it would occur in the selection of fabrics, the cut, the details, and so forth. We can see clearly how the Weber jimbauri fits in. And here you can see the back, where the identity of these garments and the individual's identity was formed through the family crest and marks of clan affiliation. And here, of course, our jimbauri stands out for its unique design. So now I would like to turn to the symbolism of the fan in warrior culture to explore some of its possible connotations. So Japanese fans are ubiquitous. They are multi-purpose. You can see them used throughout the history of Japanese art and in representations of their use in earlier periods. And they're often treated as functional objects. They're one of the premier formats for painting and calligraphy in Japanese history. But one of the things that is less talked about is how they actually have a kind of talismanic property. And this is what I'll be talking about in this section. And looking at actual artifacts of fans, they open up onto some incredibly interesting structures of belief in the pre-modern period. As I mentioned, however, they are ubiquitous, and so are warrior fans. So the jimbauri that we're focusing on tonight, it has a white fan. In the context of a military garment, it might evoke the so-called battle fan or commander's fan, gunsen, which is usually emblazoned with a red sun and is seen everywhere in representation of battles throughout Japanese painting history, as in this hand scroll depicting the later 3 Years' War, which occurred during the late Heian period in northern Japan. Here, a military commander uses an open fan as he seems to shout directions to his men facing an onslaught of enemy arrows. Just below the figure with the fan, we see someone who has let his shield down to shoot an enemy soldier, only to be shot in the eye himself, hence the spray of blood in this scene. And when I said that the battle fan is ubiquitous, it really is, even in scrolls like this, the War of the 12 Zodiac Animals, a story about a very bold tanuki, or sometimes translated as raccoon dog, who raises a kind of ragtag group of non-zodiacal animals here to get retribution over his mistreatment by the more erai, the sort of very grand zodiac animals here who he had the audacity to interrupt and to attempt to assert himself into their gathering, only to be beaten to a pulp by these very angry representations of the zodiac here. So the tanuki suits up And he raises his army, and of course, we see him employing his battle fan there on the field, directing his troops. And here's a close-up as well. So it's these kinds of representation that I think have us overlook the battle fan, to think that it is very generic and kind of uninteresting. But I think there's a lot more, especially when we look at actual artifacts of battle fans, which I'll turn to in a moment. In addition to the battlefield, they were also used for processions. And here in the scroll of the Mongol invasions, you can see two warriors holding the very typical form in which they have, or the oldest form, which they have the red background and the golden disc. This 15th century actual fan with a red ground and golden sun represents an archaic form with paper only on one side of the frame. The wide ribs of this fan have been delicately carved, just like the example I think you can see over here, held by the warrior in the scroll painting. This particular fan was one of 5 donated by the 8th Ashikaga shogun Yoshimasa in 1458 to Atsuta Shrine. Each of the fans that he dedicated were intended to correspond and to honor the 5 kami enshrined there, including the sun goddess Amaterasu. Although round fans were originally imported to Japan from China, the paper folding fan seems to have been a Japanese invention. In fact, it's documented as such in Chinese sources. After large numbers of fans in this form, the one-sided form, were exported to China and the Korean Peninsula, it appears that the two-sided fan was invented in Ming China and then reintroduced to Japan, or introduced to Japan, in the Muromachi period. The two-sided fan, with its ribs hidden between the paper surfaces, allowed for the double-sided painting most common from the Muromachi period onward, a format that I think most people are very familiar with. It's a wonderful format for painting and calligraphy, allowing amateur artists and professional artists and others to play with relationships between front and back in terms of subject matter, in terms of ideas of exterior and interior, of self and other, and it really functions incredibly well with a variety of dance performances and in terms of which side is put forward and so forth as a part of the choreographed movement. In this war fan, the red sun appears against gold clouds on the front, and a silver crescent moon is on the back. According to tradition, this was owned by the warrior Mori Motonari. Apparently, he always brought this fan into battle, believing that its charismatic power led to his decisive victory in 1555 against the Sue clan in the battle at Itsukushima. From early on, fans, and not just battle fans, were believed to have inherent in their form the power to summon the gods, and we see this in literature and so forth, or to eradicate evil forces. They were good luck symbols as well, and this investment in their auspiciousness and supernatural power appears pretty explicitly in Muromachi and Edo-period texts. Like this manual on military matters by Ise Sadatake, an expert on etiquette and history whose family had been advisors to military leaders since the Ashikaga shoguns. Sadatake worked for the Edo Bakufu, and in this text, he compiled information from countless old sources. In these pages, he explains not only how battle fans should be made, providing information about measurements, coloration, and painted motifs, but he also explains exactly how they should be wielded and offered to the gods, noting how use of the sun and moon during day and night, respectively, can be effective. An even more explicit example of the use of fans in this capacity comes by way of this really remarkable fan in which the sun corresponds to Dainichi, identified by a Sanskrit syllable in the center, surrounded by 8 smaller circles, designated as stars, a configuration that is intended to represent the Taizokai, or the womb realm in Buddhism. On the reverse, the silver side, we find the diamond realms, or the Kongokai, with Sanskrit characters that correspond to 8 bodhisattvas. The fan was said to have been owned by Hosokawa Tadaoki. So it's important to put this in context, for example, of Shingon esoteric rituals. And here you're looking at what the two sides of that fan corresponded to, the diamond realm and womb realm, in the form of this famous 9th century mandala pair in Japan. And we should also think about the kinds of religious institution, the system of religious institutions that were aligned with military leaders, powerful religious advisors who would perform rites for these rulers, and the kind of entrenched belief systems that persisted throughout the medieval and early modern period. Imagine, for example, having seen rituals before these two mandala, being able to hold in your hand a portable two world mandala that maps out the Buddhist cosmos as you bring it into battle or show it in a performative way before your troops. For the warrior Date Masamune, who famously wore a helmet with a large crescent moon ornament, and who brings a sun banner into battle, the images are related as well to his own mystical origins and esoteric Buddhist belief. The symbolism of the design is explained in the history of the Date clan, the 17th century record of the administration of Lord Shozan, where it explains that upon Masamune's birth in 1567, his father bestowed upon him the Hinomaru banner, the sun banner, and the crescent helmet ornament. And his father explains that it symbolizes the diamond and womb realms of Shingon Buddhism. So Masamune becomes a warrior who embodies the Buddhist cosmos in his garments and in his accoutrement. And in the representation here, which bears a waka poem above in Masamune's own hand, he rides forward encircled in a moon disk in a very interesting and unifying image. But it was more than esoteric Buddhism or kami worship being put to use on the battlefield. This incredible fan provides evidence for an even more pervasive belief system, that of Yin Yang Divination. This is a fan that references those kinds of practices and the importance of the I Ching in Tokugawa warrior culture better than any example I've seen. On the front of the fan is the red sun on a gold ground with the Sanskrit character in the center, surrounded by the 12 animal zodiac symbols. On the gold disc on the back, there is another Sanskrit syllable surrounded by circles for performing a year of divinations. As explained by the scholar Wai Ming-ing, whose book is The I Ching and Tokugawa Thought, the Yin-Yang military thought, or Gunbai Shiso, was popularized and institutionalized during the Heian period in the Bureau of Divination, where those officials were dispatched by the government to regional regiments to give divination advice based on the Book of Changes. Military commanders used I Ching divination, astrology, and geomancy to make specific military decisions about the date of combat, the type of tactics, and so forth. Advisors used yarrow stalks to make hexagrams, and they often decided the date and time of combat and the color and form of military symbols, which general to choose for a given campaign, and other military matters. So for certain warriors who they had a tendency to classify almost everything according to yin yang and wuxing 5 elements divination. And as you might imagine, these experts in divination became all powerful. Date Masamune was also involved, his clan was involved in yin yang divination. You can even see here, for example, a banner that contains 2 hexagrams that pronounce that connection for all to see. And here in this scroll, showing a procession from 1857, that same banner being put to use. So now, looking back at that Jimbauri that I showed you in the earlier part of this talk on the history of Jimbauri, it's interesting. This is, again, a coat from the Date clan, and you can see their crest in the back, to think about these dots not as polka dots as they're usually referred to, but instead as stars. Stars in the 5 colors, which would have been perfectly compatible with military leaders who were interested in tapping into the powers of divination. To actually wear them on the body was to garner that power and to make sure that the forces of divination that he had in his control were for all to see. We might even see stars at the base of the Fuji coat that I showed you, the black dots perhaps forming a pattern that would have meant something concerning the auspiciousness of divination charts. So investment in I Ching divination continued into the Edo period, as seen in these objects owned by Tokugawa Ieyasu, which include several fans, but also this incredible example here that has all of the markings necessary for divination. So the fan and its connection to these kind of otherworldly powers was a source of power and a show of strength. And they were images and objects that were born symbolically in banners into battle, including this array of banners and a fan example that was used by Tokugawa Ieyasu. Ieyasu famously bore a golden fan into the epic Battle of Sekigahara in 1601, his victory at which allowed him to seize control of the country. And here I can show you the actual banner, which is huge, a banner here that was on display in 2015, for example, which was made of 10 lacquered bamboo ribs, each 231 centimeters in length, and covered in gold foil, covered washi paper, and it was hoisted atop a almost 6 meter tall pole. So as a symbol of such power and general auspiciousness, it should come as no surprise that the fan in its myriad configurations became a popular object out of which to fashion a family crest. And in this publication that I'm showing you here, which compiles pre-Meiji period examples and explains their origins, there's an entire section on fan crests. The earliest recorded example of a fan crest occurred in documents pertaining to the lineage of the Satake clan, where it claims that Satake Hideyoshi received the fan crest, a 5-ribbed fan with a moon disk, in 1189 from Minamoto no Yoritomo, the first shogun of the Kamakura shogunate. And this is the first fan here that starts this section on fans. So what about the Weber's Jimbauri tattered fan? Could it be somehow related to a family crest? Clearly, its pictorial complexity sets it apart from the graphic clarity required of family crests that are intended to be immediately legible, so that one's clan or group affiliation, if in procession with the daimyo, for example, is immediately clear. The tattered fan is far from this. The placement of the fan on the garment where it hits the lower back is also unusual, and in marked contrast to the usual placement just above and between the shoulder blades. As Nagasaki Iwao has described, it is as though the fan has fluttered down from the top of the shoulder blades now to the waist, expressing an appreciation for the aesthetics of decay. Rather than natural decay, one might even be reminded of episodes of deliberate destruction of a fan, as one of the most famous episodes from the Tale of the Heike describes. The 14th century epic that recounts struggles between the Taira and the Minamoto clans during the Genpei Wars from 1180 to 1185 are depicted here. Some of those skirmishes here on these screens, also in the Weber collection, which were made in the 17th century during the Edo period. The victors, the Minamoto, would go on to establish the first military shogunal government in Kamakura, launching a shared polity between court and bakufu that would last until the Meiji Restoration in 1868. So these spectacular and detailed screens are really proof to how these tales of the Heike had such currency throughout the Edo period. They were recounted in all forms of visual art and in an array of literary texts, and these tales were performed on the stages of all performing arts, from No to Jōruri puppet theater to kabuki. One of the most famous episodes to be performed and retold happened here. You can see the red circle at the Battle of Yashima. In an episode named after a young warrior archer named Nasu no Yoichi, the young man is called upon by the commander Minamoto no Yoshitsune to shoot a fan held aloft on a pole on the prow of a Taira boat. And here you can see that boat. So the fan and the boat appeared rather suddenly, and a young court lady of 18 or 19 wearing red hakama emerged from inside the boat, took a red fan emblazoned with a gold sun and put it atop a tall pole, and then stood it on the prow and then beckoned to the Minamoto. At first, the men were unsure of the meaning of these movements and these actions by this woman, but they decided it must be a mark for them to hit. And so Nasu no Yoichi is called upon to take down the fan. According to the story, dusk has begun to fall and he can barely see the target. So he rides out into the water as the north wind blows hard and high waves lap at the beach. The boat pitched and rolled and the fan atop the pole flapped in the wind. Yoichi invokes the gods, the great Bodhisattva Hachiman, among others, draws his bow and lets the arrow fly. The whirring sound of the arrow reverberated as it flew straight to its mark, striking the fan at its rivet. The fan flew up into the air, it fluttered and dipped in the spring winds, and then suddenly it dropped into the water. When the red gleaming fan in the rays of the setting sun bobbed up and down on the white crests of the waves, even the Taira applauded Yoichi's accomplishment. As an aside, thinking about the role of fans in divination that I've just outlined, it's interesting to interpret this episode of the Heike through this lens. The description of the young woman who kind of evokes a miko or a shamaness, whose silent actions are at first confusing to the Minamoto, suggests a figure in communication with the gods. Seeing the fan as an omen that can portend the future, its destruction certainly suggests the fate of the Taira. But perhaps the takeaway image here is of the destroyed fan bobbing on the glistening waves at twilight. In most images of the Heike, the fan is shown severed across the ribs and with its solar disk split down the center. And in this fan painting, a detail of which you see here, we see how less that image seemed too poetic. There's another image included from later in the tale in which Yoichi shoots and kills a Taira soldier who dances on the prow after Yoichi's conquest. In this way, the Heike tales veer back and forth between scenes of graphic violence and poetic prose that place the violence within a poignant Buddhistic framework of mujo or impermanence. As in the famous lines, the first lines of the tales of Heike that pronounce life's ephemerality and uncertainty. So looking back at the Weber fan on the back of the Jimbauri, it's hard not to see this image as an echo of the 14th century topos of military prowess and power found in that popular tale. The back slit, so clearly articulated in white and silver, might even evoke in the imagination the tall pole supporting the fan in the Taira boat. The placement of the fan down the back of the garment recalls the stricken Taira battle fan fluttering down from the pole. Its stark black and the stark black background of the garment serves as a black canvas on which to imagine either sea or sky. But the tattered fan here is far more damaged than any of the usual images of Taira fans. In this way, it recalls yet another story that by the 18th century in Japan had become a part of warrior lore, that of the origin of the painting subject of fans afloat. One of the most spectacular examples of that painting theme was found on the walls of Nagoya Castle, and here you can see the extant paintings from that room, which was created, the rooms created for the visit of a shogun. And once again, we can turn to the Bakufu advisor, Issei Sadatake, who in his miscellaneous writings relates a legend about the origin of the painting theme, explaining how once in the Muromachi period, the Ashikaga shogun, while on a visit to Tenryuji Temple in Saga in western Kyoto, saw a young boy standing on a bridge. And when the fan he was holding was carried onto the wind and tossed upon the river, the shogun saw it dance on the surface as it was carried away. Moved by the elegance of the image, he instructed his companions to toss their own fans onto the river. And ever since, Sadatake writes, folding screens on the theme of fans afloat were set up for the shogun's visits to Gozan temples. In creating this legend, Sadatake and others contribute to the construction of a notion of a warrior ethos that involves an acute sensitivity to an aesthetics of fleeting time. For nothing epitomizes the incessantly changing universe than the flowing river. The fan provides the perfect complement to this notion because of the way it can stand in as a surrogate for its owner and for the owner's human body, who is then seen to be thrown about by the unpredictability of the universe. The fans afloat theme was one of the most popular subjects in Japanese painting, and here you can see an example where courtesans are viewing tossed fans on the river with oversized fans compared to the figure size, evoking actual fans and their use, although these were in fact painted on the screen. And here you can, in this example, you can see even two fans here and here in the process of being destroyed. Two fans are being split between their ribs as they encounter the posts of the bridge across this river. As Ueno Tomoe, curator at the Suntory Museum of Art, has pointed out, this seems to be the conceptual source for the image of the tattered fan found, for example, on sword guards. And this is actually one of the only places that I've been able to find an image of a fan as tattered as the one on the back of our Jimbauri. But here you can see how this sword guard shows two decimated fans represented through a delicate use of gold and silver inlay. The fans are just thoroughly ravaged against waves. You can see the ripples of the waves, which even look like smoke, invoking the notion of ephemerality and impermanence. And here's another one owned by Hosokawa Sansai, famous warrior aesthete, where cherry blossoms and the countless waka that liken the short-lived fluorescence of the flowers to the fleeting nature of life, youth, and beauty make the point very explicit. In every case, the fan is the perfect object to impart these lessons. The structure of the fan with its slats or ribs, referred to in Japanese as hone or bones, is hard not to equate with images of the skeleton, the corpse, evoking the drastic method for achieving awakening to the illusory nature of the world that is the contemplation of corpses described as practiced by Buddhist monks, and with its own painting genre, the 9 stages of decay. The tattered fan here has been truly torn to shreds. The 2 pieces of paper that make up the front and back of the fan have been split apart. The conceit of the image is that the front surface of the fan has been ripped from its frame and that the back paper has been freed to swing to the other side here on the axis of this outer slat. It creates a nearly perfect half circle across the back of the garment. The fully open fan had always been viewed as a symbol of abundance and good luck. Here the fan is open, but hyper-extended in an unnatural way, like a distended or violated cadaver. The possibility for graphic anthropomorphic metaphors are endless, but it's also important to take into account the designer's sensibility, how they cleverly arrayed this fan and made sure to leave enough flesh on the ribs to show the two sides of the fan, while making the image abstract enough to elicit an endless chain of associations, from the mystical warrior fan imbued with magic to the fan as iconography of transience. The bones of this fan, however, are golden and numinous and elevate the image from the realm of the mundane, in effect glorifying the violence done, linking it to perhaps to a transcendent cause. And thinking back to the embodied understanding of textiles that we must use to approach these kinds of works, and to the consideration of who might have commissioned and worn this garment, it seems easy to argue for a sentiment that values the sort of warrior ethos of fighting to the end, of never retreating, and of seeing the loss of life as inevitable in defense of the righteous fight. And it is also easy to condemn the sentiment as an aestheticization of violence, or in the case of Edo Japan, the threat of violence and its localized implementation to keep an authoritarian regime in power. Thinking about the garment as created by an individual, a garment that was well worn, and keeping in mind its idiosyncratic qualities among this type of clothing, is it possible to interpret the image and its recognition of the shared fragile human condition as an attempt to preserve a grain of humanity in the midst of violence, to prevent the total numbness to violence, a kind of cri de coeur for someone whose involvement in the system was not necessarily a choice? Whatever the case may be, the discourse of impermanence accommodates all of these ambiguities found in this jacket. And as the exhibition makes clear, it accommodates the entire history of Japanese art. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Melissa, for a really, really rich presentation. That's such a striking image, and I'm just wondering whether we have some time for some questions now. Just wondering, thinking about your discussion earlier about the gunsen and kind of the qualities of that fan and the qualities of this fan. Do you think that this fan relates to that at all? What do you think about the kind of the blankness of it, just the white surface? What do you think the intention might have been for that? Do you have any ideas?
That's really the question of the day. And it's one of the things that I was trying to unpack by sort of making the possible horizon of expectations of a 19th century viewer who might have been informed by the writings of Issei Sadatake and the kind of history of the Heike fan and other fans, to show kind of the range of possibilities for what it might mean despite its blankness. And I think, as I sort of alluded to at the end, that maybe because of its blankness, it really leaves open the possibility of multiple kinds of interpretations. And I think that includes our own, and the freedom to sort of make what we want of this image, to use it to sort of springboard on issues that we are concerned with today. It really is a kind of spectacular image in that regard, and that it is so perfectly abstract that I think it can accommodate interesting interpretations, and ones that allow you to go outside even the realm of the Japanese battlefield, for example, to think about larger issues.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. I have another question here. By the 19th century, could Jinbaori be seen as an expression of culture of fashion with a parallel to the Regency dandy?
Great question. Interesting. Yes, and I actually had an example that I took out of the PowerPoint, which was a beautiful black Jinbaori with the stark just crest of the 7 treasures that was owned by the tea master, garden designer, Kobori Enshu. And I think that for him, it might have been an element of fashion, and thinking about the word fashion, not in terms of the way we use it today necessarily, but of everything that that involves in the pre-modern use of dress. So he, as someone who would, not engaged in battle, for example, and he was known actually to have collected a Jinbaori. So I think that's very much a possibility. Another function that I didn't have time to mention was a kind of symbolic use of Jinbaori for young boys. So small versions of Jinbaori made upon the birth of a child, of a boy, and used for coming of age ceremonies and kind of a symbol of inheritance of a family.
Fascinating. Another question, what do we know about the craftspeople who made these Jinbaori? What was their relationship to their samurai clients?
Another awesome question, and one that I would love to know more about. I was able to look at a couple of articles again by this wonderful textile expert, Nagasaki Iwao, who's written on so many different topics, including Jinbaori. And among his work is one article that talks about actually how women were involved in procuring the warrior garments for the men in their household. So they could have sewn them, they could have commissioned them. But I have to say, these garments are not difficult to make. So it really is a vest. With a minimal number of parts. I mean, that being said by someone who doesn't own a sewing machine and would have no idea how to make this myself. But in terms of, I think, more complicated dresses and so forth, maybe the most difficult thing would be the procurement of exotic, expensive fabrics. Putting it together might be less of a difficult task.
Let me see if we have any others. I think that seems to be what we have at this point. Actually, it's after 7:30 now, so technically it's the end of the presentation, and so I really want to thank you for again just such a really wonderful presentation to kind of bring our whole season of programming around the Art of Impermanence to a conclusion. And it's been such a pleasure working on this exhibition and having you and so many other great scholars contribute to this whole presentation. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I want to again extend my thanks to you and to Dr. John Weber and to the Asia Society, and also to wish you a warm congratulations on the exhibition and its opening. And my condolences that it had to close so soon after opening, but you have preserved it forever online, and I hope people take advantage of seeing it. So thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, and thanks to all our viewers for joining us tonight and in the future. Take good care. Stay safe.
Good night.
Good night.